to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them.
Well, hello and welcome again to our podcast, Islands at War. And it's Keith Bengelli here, and also
Nick Lahiri. Hi, Keith.
Hi, Nick. Okay, Nick. So this we're in May 1943 already, and rationing. The Germans wish to introduce a reduction in the rationing across the islands, but I think we're going to start with Guernsey first, and then what we'll do is go across to Jersey. And the Germans needed to justify this, and they announced this, I think, in April 1943. They were talking about impending ration cuts then in April, claiming that they were necessary due to British bombing of supply ships, and the German justification was that the RAF was sinking food supplies kindly guaranteed by the German army. So there's quite a lot here, isn't there?
Yeah, there is quite a lot here. So we've got kind of two key threads that go on for this episode of the podcast for May 1943. And it caused a bit of a fuss, Kit. I was just mentioning to you before we started, or we briefly touched on this in the April 43 episode. And I rather innocuously put the actual press cutting up on a history Facebook page, and it caused a bit of a stir. People were saying, no, because I said, we talked about this, it's propaganda, and they were like, no, it wasn't. And it was anyway. This episode wraps all of this up anyway.
It's strange.
What it was.
Yes.
It caused some quite emotive answers. I was quite bemused by some of them, but there we go.
Yeah, I mean, it's we talk about a lot of things which are could be deemed to be controversial. It's odd that this one's caused such a fuss.
I really didn't think this one was going to be controversial. At least the Vale Mill photo that I shared wasn't, which was one taken just after the
pretty banal.
Mill with its extra 2 floors that it doesn't have now. So yeah, there's quite a bit to cover here. So we'll be talking about the rationing and the rationale behind the rationing.
The rationale behind the rationing.
If we're going to talk about that. But also, comes into this as well, what the heck was going on with the bombing of convoys, etc. by the RAF. And boy, were the RAF busy by the time we got to May 43. April 43, they were busy. I mean, they've been busy most of the year. May, they really stepped it up in terms of around the Channel Islands. You can see there were ships getting sunk, and there were convoys being attacked. And the Germans just used this as an excuse, frankly. They were trying all sorts of things to justify quite why they were going to be cutting the rations. Now, if you look into it a little bit further, you're going to find that the ships that got sunk, what do you reckon was on board?
Go on.
Cement.
Yes, I thought that word was going to come up.
There was concrete, there was all sorts of things that you need for building bunkers. There was diddly squat in the way of food. So that immediately raises some alarm bells when you look at that from a 2025 perspective, when you're looking to see whether things
one of the things that I always wondered about was, given the fact that the Allies were able to listen into the communications that were coming out of the Kriegsmarine bunker here, whether they had some way of sort of triaging the raids, but essentially if it moved, RAF were going to go after it.
A lot of these were spotted. Most of these were spotted either by Spitfires that were on reconnaissance missions. We do have the dubious honour of being one of the most photographed places during the between 1940 and 45. Photography started taking place in 1940, really ramped up by the time we were getting to 43 here. And so there were reconnaissance Spitfires that were doing the rounds. They're even going back as far as 1940. They might have been busy with the Battle of Britain, but there was still things like Avro Ansons were running regular patrols to try and spot shipping and things then. They weren't really going after the shipping for the Channel Islands at that point, but it was. Then you had aircraft that were coming back from raids, and they're coming over, and they either have a target of opportunity, or they see, they might be coming back, they've got no bombs left, or they're short on fuel, but they make a note of the fact that they see coming out of St Malo, there's a nice convoy, or coming out of Granville, and they're heading in the direction of the Channel Islands. So they report that in, and away we go. Okay, let's send our friends from 263 Squadron, who are based down at Warmwell in Dorset. We'll send them to go and attack it. And as we discussed earlier, these are going to really ruin your day. They've got 4 20mm cannon. This is the Whirly bomber, so the Whirlwind, which had been modified for bombing, and very, very successful by all accounts. But we'll come back to what they got up to later on. So, you can see why the Germans might want to use this as an excuse.
Now, they sort of announced that there was going to be these cuts to the rationings, but it seems as well that Reverend Ord, one of our diarists, he'd been approached by a prominent states official, and he was asked to sort of discreetly disseminate the idea that there may be ration cuts.
Yeah, so this was kind of dumped on the controlling committee. The notice came out on the 30th of April in the press. The Germans told the controlling committee pretty much as it went to press. It was saying the British are bombing you and then all this sort of stuff. We talked about it last time, so catch the previous episode if you want. I may even risk putting the order up again at some point on our social media. I'll certainly put it in the show notes so you can see it there.
So at the moment we are talking about Guernsey. The controlling committee was the government of Guernsey at the time when we referred to the controlling committee.
Yeah.
But
Jersey,
we will get on to Jersey.
Jersey were in exactly the same boat. They got told at the same time rations are going to be cut because of this, because of the RAF bombing, etc. So the controlling committee here and the committee in Jersey, called the Superior Council, they were debating what to do. What are we going to do about it? So we're talking here, this is the 2nd of May when Ord is approached by a prominent member of the government after one of his church services down at St Sampson's. Not at Ord's normal church. He's normally at Ebenezer in St Peter, but he does travel around because there's a distinct lack of clergymen due to the deportation, so they're having to share around which congregations that they go to preach at. Now he's approached there because they're concerned that they're not being, the Germans control the press. There's no way that they can get anything to the paper to say, look, don't panic, folks. We're on the case. We're trying to negotiate something with the Germans. So he goes for ask Reverend Ord to discreetly get the message out there if he can, which is difficult.
So Ord tells the people that he knows, obviously, the people that he can trust as well. And these reductions, presumably they're not just going to go right across the board. There must be some sort of exemptions for certain people in the workforce and what might even be seen as preferential treatment. So there were exemptions, weren't there?
Yeah, there were. And boy, was this divisive.
Oh, I bet it was.
So, and this was across the islands, full rations for individuals working for the German authorities. So if you were working for the Germans, you got your full rations. And they were even concerned that people might be able to draw their normal rations and the rations that they would get for working for the Germans. The other slightly perverse rule was that sick individuals exempted from the order. Now that makes sense. You've got people that they're seriously ill. They need the rations, and we'll come back to that later on. But the doctors and nurses that are treating them are not exempted.
No,
despite the fact they're treating the sick, quite often having to, the doctors are having to travel quite, in some cases travel some distance to go and treat people in their own homes. They're having to do it on foot or by bicycle in a lot of cases. If they're lucky, they've got access to a car. They need all the energy they can get.
Now, these exemptions, would they have been driven by the Geneva Convention? Where's the Geneva Convention with regard to what the Germans are doing here?
Well, the Germans, as usual, try and say that it's part of the Hague Convention and they're allowed to do it.
Well, yeah, maybe Hague Convention, but not Geneva.
Yeah, exactly. And they try all sorts of things. They even tell, Louis Guillemette that Major Kratzer basically infers that it's perfectly legal for the occupying country to make a law, changing these things, provided the law applies in the occupying country. Louis Guillemette says, well, that's like saying, you pass a law saying everybody has to wear top hats, and points out to him it's a little bit ludicrous, and the German just ends up laughing at that one. But yeah, it was obviously very divisive. The others that were exempt, of course, as well were, and again this caused a bit of a fuss, were the French, which was because they were cutting rationing in France as well, and the Irish.
Okay, so we have French people working on the island that are not organisation towed.
French people that were here anyway.
Yes, and they're not slave workers. So this is French civilians that are almost resident.
Yeah, just French resident.
Yeah, and of course the Irish people were neutral. And was there a sizable Irish contingent over here?
So in Jersey.
More so in Jersey, yeah.
But there was still a reasonably sizable amount of Irish here. There were Swiss, there were various other neutrals, and others from friendly countries to the Germans.
Now there wasn't a lot to be had anyway. Can you give us some examples of what was actually going to be reduced and by how much?
Bread was likely to be cut by 50%, and cooking fats and meat were likely to be cut similarly by 50%, which is pretty disastrous. I mean, the meat, that was going to be cut to 2 ounces a week.
Yeah, so that's like a sausage.
Well, if that, I mean, that's like one of those really cheap supermarket burgers, the thinnest one that you can possibly get, and chop it in half.
Yeah, because we're talking about a reduction, of course, in quantity here, but the quality had long gone anyway, and a lot of the nutritional value had gone out of anyway.
Well, and the other problem they had was that because of course the Germans were shipping all this stuff, which wasn't food, but they're shipping that, and all the stuff that we had actually managed to buy, a lot of it's being held up in Granville and spoiling while it's there. So that was an added problem as well. It's a bit of a joke as well, because they very quickly work out that these cuts just don't make sense, even if the shipping was being sunk. They just make no sense whatsoever, because Jersey was self-sufficient in flour, because it's a much bigger place than Guernsey. Guernsey wasn't self-sufficient in flour, and with Guernsey did absolutely fine with butter. Not a problem, enough butter for everybody, yet they're cutting it.
Yeah.
The meat ration as well was a disaster, because they just didn't have any meat for about 3 weeks in May.
And also, bringing this reduction into force in the way that we've described, the Germans also sought to control the food storage. Now, presumably these are the stocks that were already on the island and future stocks coming in. The Germans wanted to control this.
Yeah, what they were really after was they wanted to, they particularly had their eye on Young's store, which was at the Glanny Esplanade, and they really wanted that store because it was the biggest one. Now, that was where the controlling committee in Guernsey had absolutely no problem with security, etc., and it was relatively secure and couldn't get stuff nicked. Had high value stuff in there, but the Germans wanted it because they wanted to store flour in it. So they basically said, well, we're going to have that. So Louis Guillemette and various others take them on a tour of other places that they might prefer to use and leave the control committee's stocks where they are. So first off, they took them to Elizabeth College and they had a look at the gym, and then went, it's in use already, and actually it wouldn't be suitable for what we wanted. So then they took them up to Morley Chapel and Le Villers Chapel, and both of those were rejected for being far too small. JFG Williams on the Esplanade, that predates my time, I don't know quite where that one was considered not large enough. And in the end, they just lost the argument. But come the end of May, they were basically told, tough, get out. So they did give them an alternative, which was St George's Hall, which the Germans were vacating. I have a guess why they might want to vacate.
Too close to the action?
Well, there was that, but also not particularly secure and not really big enough. So the controlling committee were faced with the problem, and this is one of the things they protested. They were going to actually have to get people to sleep there to protect the stuff if it was shifted there, but their beds were told to get knotted.
Yes, because there had been people listening to the previous episodes that led up to this episode here. There had been a spate of burglaries and such like. Now, did the government protest at all? I guess they must have done.
Yeah, they did in both islands. There were some similarities and some differences. Initially, the Controlling Committee in Guernsey, they debated and drafted various different letters on the 1st and 2nd of May.
Excuse me?
Yeah, they debated, and on the 1st and 2nd of May, they were backward and forth in their discussions. They couldn't make their mind up what to do. It was suggested that maybe, as a protest, they'd all resign.
But the bailiff couldn't be.
Well, this was a difficult thing because basically the bailiff was acting as the lieutenant governor, so the monarch's representative in the Channel Islands, and basically his orders have been basically do your best for the island's inhabitants. Thanks very much.
Yes, stay in place.
But that was his last order that he received before the Germans arrived. So he was a bit stuffed. He couldn't resign because obviously he couldn't be replaced. The rest of the Controlling Committee in Guernsey were divided roughly 50-50. Do we resign as a protest? Have they crossed that red line? Because they had thought about resigning before. Do we do this, and will they actually pay any attention to the fact that we resign? And they came to the conclusion that actually, if we just go, stuff it, we're going to resign, the Germans would have paid no attention. In fact, actually, they've probably been happy as
Exactly.
they would have had no pushback from anybody. They probably wouldn't have allowed another Controlling Committee to be formed. They'd have just bulldozed everything, or even if they had managed to get another Controlling Committee, they probably wouldn't have had, the ability to. They'd be losing 3 years in knowledge, basically.
Yes, I think really history would say we probably, what was a Controlling Committee, 6-7 individuals, we probably had the best people in place. I think history vindicates that.
Yeah, absolutely. And they've had criticism over the years. This was part of the problem that was even when this representative from the States was talking to Ward. He was saying that we can't get across to the people why we make a decision about something, or why we look like we haven't been doing anything. But they have, but they can't get the message out there. They just can't, because they can't put anything in the press. There's absolutely nothing about what the Controlling Committee. I sat and read the newspapers, nothing. Because the Germans aren't stupid. They're not going to let them put a counterpoint across it in the paper. That would just really stuff up their argument in the first place.
So as far as the population are concerned, the Germans are imposing these cuts. It almost looks as if our government hasn't tried to intercede. The cuts themselves, I believe there have been some sort of what we would probably call now risk assessments. There have been some medical assessments done, haven't there? Our friend Dr. Simmons, for example.
Yeah, so basically what happens is Simmons does his report. Simmons has already come to the attention that he's the medical officer of health. The Germans already don't like him because he wrote a report in 1941 saying that the rationing in 1941 wasn't good enough. They weren't very happy about it. Then this really does annoy them. They actually try and get him sacked in 1944, later on in 44. Because they tried really hard to get rid of him. They absolutely hated him because he was just writing a factually correct thing. There's a bit of an odd one because they again couldn't get things like insulin. You tried negotiating. What are we going to do? We can't get insulin for patients. We did talk a little bit about that in the past. But it causes a massive problem. But Simmons also pointed out that basically this diet was going to finish a lot of people off.
Yes, that's right. I think he sort of coined a phrase like it's a death sentence for some people.
Yeah, and Ord said very much the same. Him being at the far end of the chain on that problem, in that he was having to bury a lot of these people that were unfortunately dying, or go and see these people who were collapsing in their own pain and all sorts of things. Now, so the debate was still ongoing. Controlling Committee's trying to work out what to do. Ask the Germans if they can phone the bailiff of Jersey.
Now, this was a first, I think, in the occupation.
We're talking almost 3 years in, because
Yeah.
it was May 1943. So we're just a month shy of basically them having been in control. The Germans said yes, much to the surprise of the controlling committee. So they were allowed to telephone the bailiff of Jersey. Don't get me wrong, there was a German. They were allowed to do it from the Feldkommandant, also from Grange Lodge in Guernsey, with a German listening and an interpreter listening, so that they knew what was going on, what was being said.
So it was controlled, but it was allowed.
It was permitted, yes. And this is the first time in almost 3 years. Incredible. I mean, there had been. Don't get me wrong, there had been communication. They were able to write.
Yeah, Louis Guillemette, I think, had already been across on sort of government business.
Yeah, there were various people who'd been across on government business. They were able to write, albeit sometimes it took quite, if the Germans wanted to hold up a letter from one bailiff to another, well, it wasn't exactly difficult for them, was it? Because they had total control of what was going on. But this was the first telephone thing, and so they were very much, the Superior Council in Jersey were very much minded the same. The bailiff there was also very much, no, we've got to oppose this, and they were keen to make the relevant protests, etc.
Can I just ask you something which we haven't discussed, so throwing something at you here. We talk about our government during the war very much as the controlling committee and headed up either by Sherwood or John Leal. But Jersey has a very strong bailiff. Bailiff Courtanche was a very, very strong bailiff. So was this communication between the controlling committee in Guernsey and the bailiff in Jersey, or did Bailiff Carey actually get involved?
No.
Yeah.
It was the two bailiffs talking to each other.
Right, yep.
At the Guernsey end, Louis Guillemette recounts who was there. He was one of them. Basically, they dragged along, most of the controlling committee went along as well, because clearly they wanted to know what was being said as well. So I would imagine it was probably fairly similar at the other end. I don't have an account which tells me. I looked at Ralph Mollert's and he doesn't mention it.
But again, it comes back to something that I think we might explore a later time, is the two differences between, and the strengths and weaknesses perhaps between the two bailiffs. But that's for another time, and it'll require some diplomacy, I think.
Our bailiff was quite elderly, and that's why the committee was put in place the way it was structured and why Ambrose Sherwood led things. That was part of the reason. I thought, we can certainly deal with that another time. Yeah, so they were aligned on what they were going to do.
But there was some sort of contradictions and inconsistencies how they were going to apply this across the islands. Is it a case of the fact that the Germans said this is how you're going to do it and this is what you're going to cut, and then it wasn't a unified order? It was interpreted differently in Jersey. There were differences.
I think we should be clear. This order came from Paris, so it wasn't an order that came. It wasn't just the Germans here in Channel Islands that dreamt this one up. And frankly, I think the field commandant were not in the least bit happy about having to deal with this, because it caused them a lot of problems. Various of the diarists, talk about the fact that Germans were very downtrodden, in not how they were perhaps behaving previously, when they were quite pleased to be enforcing an order, etc. They were taking no more. Certainly, the ones that the controlling committee in Guernsey were dealing with were taking no pleasure from having to introduce this. But they did end up with a difference in Jersey. I don't know how. It must have been. The only thing I can think is that perhaps the Germans tried to bribe Jersey by making their bread ration not go down by as much. So we were facing 50%, Jersey 20%.
Now, the thing about Jersey, of course, is less people evacuated. And for people that are aware that there are two main Channel Islands, there was great differences in the way the economies were structured at the time. Guernsey was very much tomatoes in greenhouses. Jersey was arable crops and potatoes, weren't they? And so there was more homegrown flour, I think, in Jersey than there would have been in Guernsey, crops under glass. And so the two islands were different anyway, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, Jersey was growing sufficient flour. They had a slight excess of flour. They had about think it was 3,300 tons of flour that they could produce, and they needed 2,800 under the existing rationing. From memory, that was Lesotho talked about that in his diary. He was you remember the chap that worked at the building merchant that seems to have had his finger on the pulse for a lot of things, including some Germans that were passing him information, documents from the Feldkommandant that he was jotting down and then giving back to them to put back the next day. I'd say he's probably a fairly good chance on that one. But also, with Guernsey being 25 square miles wide, that made a big difference. But also, certainly at this stage, we're much more fortified. There was a lot more land had been taken away to be used
on Guernsey.
Guernsey, in terms of building things like mirrors and various other fortifications around the islands and stuff like that. In comparison, there was a lot less land that was free to be used. And they built things like, they'd done the same in Jersey. They built camps for the workers on the fortress and stuff like that. But when you're squishing it into 25 square miles as opposed to 45, then that makes a difference.
So we have this united protest. Essentially, Nick, the Germans got what they wanted. There was no mitigations, really, apart from the exemptions.
Oh, yeah, there was no mitigation at all. Jersey got away with 20%. But don't get me wrong, Jersey didn't cave in or anything like that. It was just, I think the Germans gave in because that was an easy win for them, because they knew that Jersey could still get by with 20%, and it kept, made things a little bit more palatable for them potentially.
So these cuts to the rations go ahead. There was, in terms of the benefit of historical hindsight, there must have been a sort of moral and strategic reflection on all of this. Were the Germans really justified in any way in doing this?
No, not really. Just to show that as well, both the controlling committee and the Superior Council in Jersey were united on the fact they needed to internationalise this protest. So Couthon said, look, on that phone call, he said, I'm writing to the Swiss ambassador in Berlin as the ambassador for the protecting power. So Switzerland was the protecting power that was supposed to be there to assist us with problems with the occupying forces. He also sent a letter to the German authorities at the Feldkommandant that was going on, and a letter to Berlin as well. There was some argument about some of the wording. The Germans got a little bit upset. Durat Lille actually offered to go and take a delegation to Geneva. Now that would have been flipping risky to do. Lille was quite an elderly man himself anyway, but that would have been a risky trip to make because of all the bombing and of the shipping, and also the bombing of France, etc. on the way. But the Germans basically said, no chance. You're not going and talk to the Swiss. Not having it. They tried to have another powwow with the bailiff of Jersey, and the Germans obviously learned their lesson from the first one and went, no. Basically, no. You're not talking to him. As it happens, the letters themselves, that's another story, and it goes on for a few months. But the finalised letter was signed by the bailiff in Guernsey, same in Jersey. The one in Guernsey was delivered to Major Kratzer at the Feldkommandant, and he got very annoyed, and the letter had to be slightly revised because he didn't like the term reprisals. He thought the term reprisals was unwarranted and didn't meet the definition of, guess what, the Hague
Convention.
Reprisals were. He said that's punitive actions for acts of sabotage, not for food shortages caused by enemy military action. Basically, I think they were told, if you don't change the wording, your letter ain't going anywhere.
The other interesting thing that sort of spun out of this as well is that Reverend Ord, as we've mentioned in previous episodes, was a fluent German speaker and was acquainted with some of the German officers that were more aligned to seeing, I think we could say that they would possibly hope for, if not an Allied victory, certainly a negotiated peace. One of his friends is Reinhold, forgive me, I've forgotten his surname now, but he offered to get some information when he says his people back in Germany to see if they could get it to the Red Cross. We're not talking about going to his parents. Is this a sort of church body?
I don't know, because you remember in the April 43 episode we talked about Reinhold had confessed that he'd actually been a prisoner for 18 months.
So we were talking about he would have had friends in some sort of very soft German resistance or independence. Intriguing.
Can't possibly know.
No.
Reinhold did basically offer, I will do my best to try and get some information back.
So back to Germany, and therefore into the International Red Cross.
And then into the International Red Cross.
Yeah, that's a very, very intriguing point.
Which would have been very risky for him.
Oh, he'd have put his head above the parapet, wouldn't he?
And we know that he suffered quite badly for 18 months at the hands of... He was a German citizen, but he got into trouble for communicating with a Czech person before the war and got into a real bother and had a real nasty set of treatment from the Gestapo. So,
I think Reinhold starts to sort of come more into focus, and we'll keep an eye on him as we move forward. So the thing is, Nick, the Germans get what they want. They reduce the rations, and then we sort of have to move forward, don't we?
Yeah. So as far as the local authorities are concerned, well, we've sent our letters of protest. There's nothing else they can do. They can't contact anybody any other way.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah. So they can't. There's nothing further that they can do apart from try and make the best of it.
And of course, these thousands and thousands of people's lives now just get more miserable, essentially.
Yeah. And going back to Simmons, the problems of things that we know people died of diabetes and multiple other things. Was people coming down with tuberculosis and various other diseases. It was basically, as we've said, it was a death sentence. The urban population is facing greater hardship. We've touched on that before. The rural population has got no room to grow something.
And of course, the other thing is that there was we're in the spring now, and we're moving to the summer, because the other thing, of course, that adds to the misery of when we get to the winter of 1943, is just trying to keep warm.
Well, and the other problem that they've had, the weather was really weird. I think we touched on this a little bit in the earlier episodes. February and March were unseasonably warm, and even April to an extent was unseasonably warm. And numerous of the diarists talk about the ground being baked hard, and that was making it difficult to grow crops. And then in May it starts to chuck it down when it should be getting warmer.
Yeah.
It starts chucking it down, and that really messes with things like the crops of potatoes, and they have problems with Colorado beetle as well. It really, really causes problems. And to make things even worse, the Germans are shipping off tomatoes or fine.
Yes, a man can't live by tomatoes alone, of course. But it seemed, the growers over here were doing their best to grow food. And of course, they're seeing the Germans export it. And they weren't paying for this, presumably. They were just appropriating it.
Well, yeah, sort of. But it was all on the account. It's a bit like...
Put it on their tab. Okay, now... I want to sort of move on here, because you've unearthed this really sort of interesting incident involving the Guernsey purchasing body, because Guernsey, as well as Jersey, had for some time been sending people to procure food in France for the local populations and things. And these guys get caught up in an RAF attack.
Yeah, so this kind of ties into what we're going to talk about shortly, but yeah. So whilst all this fuss is going on about this rationing and things like that, they're a bit worried about what's happened to our men from Cromwell, because the three of them were coming back. A chap called Louis Beggin, Vodin, and I think the other chap was Rumblow. There was an attack we talked about on the 27th of April. There was a convoy that was attacked. We talked about it in the last episode. Sorry, not the last episode, in April 43, because of course this one's going to be going out after the special I'm doing at the Imperial War Museum. The April 43 episode, we talked about the convoy being attacked, it's being sunk, etc., seriously damaged. Now, the controlling committee are a bit worried, because they know that they were on these boats, and they just don't know what's happened to them. And there's been no word. Obviously, if they can't communicate, it wasn't something that they asked the bailiff about. Frankly, that wasn't one of the things that he was to be worried about. They basically found out because they went. Louis Gilmer eventually saw one of the ships coming in Guernsey, 8th of May, and he went and spoke to them and was then able to find out that the missing men were in Jersey to start off with, and they'd basically been on the ship. They'd been sat on some oil drums, in fact, seated near 3 petrol barrels at the stern. Bearing in mind this is a glorified barge. If you're going to get attacked, you don't really want to be sat on a petrol barrel.
No, not really.
You really want to be. One of them was retrieving a bottle of wine as they were heading this way, and the cork popping coincided with 5 or 6 planes attacking at mast height, which ties in with what our account that we had in the April episode from the RAF point of view was. And there's a big white flash, a spent cannon shell landed near the men, and they thought, hang on a minute, let's get in the cabin. Fortunately, there was minimal damage to that ship, but the captain initially told them we're sinking, and fortunately that proved to be false. Now these guys had various different problems as well, because some of them had been sentenced that they were going to be put into internment, and they'd been sent basically to go and train a couple of people in Granville, but they were supposed to be going back. But after a long discussion, they basically got allowed to stay. That would have been a bit nasty. But Louis got quite interesting stories out of them. Aside from that one, one of the guys that was working for the Guernsey authorities was in fact French, and he got stopped by a German soldier. Because they had a couple of Guernsey trucks with Guernsey registration plates, so no letters, no anything.
No, just numbers.
Just numbers. Now, this German had never seen a vehicle like this before, and there's some disagreement whether it was a French gendarme or a German. But to be fair, I've had this happen only probably about 10 years ago, where a French gendarme was standing by my car when I came back to where I'd parked it in the square in the middle of a village in Brittany, and I was thinking, what's up? And it turned out he just wanted to know where it was from, and this is kind of how the questioning went between this either this German or a French gendarme, and I did like the reply. This is an American lorry belonging to the English, driven by a Frenchman under German authority. If that didn't confuse the hell out of him, I don't know what would have really. I mean, and the other problem they had with these lorries, of course, is they were having to operate. They had these big gas bags. They were running on gasoline, and they were doing a weekly run to Paris for textiles. But I think it was taking them a week to pretty much do it.
The thing about numbers, just numbers, we've alluded to on the number plates, it should be explained to people outside of the Channel Islands that in Jersey, the number plate has a J and some numbers. In Guernsey, we just have numbers. Now, some people might say, why don't you have a G in front of the numbers? And Gibraltar has already got the G, I believe.
Although the governor does have G1 on.
Yes, he does. He does. Yeah. So Guernsey number plates, just numbers. Yeah. Only place in the world, I think.
I tell you what, I have known it confuse those number plate recognition things in the UK, where they've got them on car parks. I once had to push the thing. I was causing a massive traffic jam because it let me in the car park. It was Stratford-on-Avon. I remember it well. It wasn't a stressful experience at all. It let me in the car park fine, but when it came to read the number plate to let me out and for me to pay, I wasn't happy. And I was at the front of this queue, and it was getting quite busy. And then the chap turned up, and he wasn't very happy about the fact I had no letters on my number plate either. And eventually, after about 10 minutes, he accepted my explanation and let me out.
The Guernsey way.
So there we go. But, yeah, I just thought that was quite a funny little.
Okay, so we have our guys that have gone over there and involved in all of these air raids and attacks on the boats, and we're aware now that we've got all of the marine activity between here and France is being watched very closely by the Allies, or the British, sort of the Allies at this stage. You've got a little bit here about civilian experience air activity in the middle of May here. The Sonnycroft Dance or something.
Yeah, there was a place called Sonnycroft. We have mentioned it before, where some of the great and the good, Louis Guillemette included, was invited along to a dance. It used to happen every so often, but you had to get permission for these things. But they were at this dance, and there was heavy anti-aircraft fire, and British, they're described as fighters, visibly manoeuvring. An initial excitement gave way to sombre reflection later on when he saw some of the German ambulances as we were walking home, and the quite young sailors that were in one of them was sat in front of one of the ambulances, quite badly injured, but obviously they didn't have room for him in the rest of the ambulance, and it kind of brought it home to him. It not just the Guernsey people that were suffering, but there was quite a lot of air activity, shall we say, and it really improved the morale of people. They were quite happy that it was all going on. It's a bit like our friend Lesotho in Jersey complaining he wasn't bombed enough, by the RAF.
The other thing that's quite interesting here, we talk about morale and people sort of that may be in the know about things and they can't sort of let on to certain people that they know things. I like this thing you've unearthed about a Guernseyman that was told by two organisation Toad officials, so this would be foreign workers here. So the Guernseyman is told by these two chaps that the African campaign was over. So the Guernseyman basically sort of says, well, who won? Which was
that he knew.
He couldn't admit that he knew who won.
Yeah, it's really strange as well, because obviously the Germans have lost in Tunisia by this point. With I think it's roughly reported around 250,000 POWs between Italians and Germans have been taken. The Germans have lost Tunisia, and the front page of the Guernsey press, containing German news, said, it made me chuckle when I was sat in the Prairie Library looking at this the other week. Big headline, and Dr. Goebbels said that Tunisia had served its purpose for the people of Germany.
Yes.
No, with no actual explanation about how getting your ass kicked and most of your forces ending up as prisoners of war was serving its purpose.
But we really are in a position, although there were darker times to come, that really there was a feeling that the corner had been turned and the Americans had been in the war for some time. The heft of American military and civilian planning were making themselves felt. Stalingrad, of course, had long been gone. The Germans really didn't have a presence now in North Africa to speak of, because I think this is the point where Rommel is given the ultimatum that was to finish him by Hitler. So later on in 1943, we'll cover off the fact that Channel Islanders are already being asked if they want to come back, and we'll go into detail on that. Moving on, we've got this. It's a sort of complex situation here, but Nick's the person to sort of go through this. The financial and currency management here, Nick. This is sort of dry stuff, but it's all interesting, isn't it?
Well, yeah, they're trying to basically work out what to do for the best. This is the controlling committee. What do? We need money to buy stuff. And also, we need money to buy stuff in France. We need currency that we can use in France. But also, we want to keep the banks here circulating sterling as well. So, as much as possible, they wanted to keep that happening now. We talked about this before. Your average Gern was hanging on to his sterling and spending his Reichsmarks because he was convinced that come the end of the war, the Reichsmarks were going to be worth diddly squat. And to a certain extent, that was true. He also had very little time to exchange them post-war, and he was hoping that his good old sterling was going to be good.
So sterling was beginning to disappear from circulation.
Yeah, it was. They had real problems because they had to start printing paper notes for lower denominations because.
This is because people were hoarding it.
Yeah. Well, the Germans were the Germans were taking some of it as souvenirs, and sending it home as a souvenir.
But that must have happened sometime earlier in the war.
It was still going on to a certain extent. So it was a combination of the fact that anybody that, well, some of the ones that we've talked about that were involved in the black market, French captains of ships, things like that, had 3 lots of money going on there. Their Reichsmarks, their French francs, and their sterling, and they were hedging their bets. But the banks had to still try and operate the British banks. So money was coming from Paris, from the Paris branches of the British banks. Although some of the Germans, we did talk about this in one of the earlier episodes, the Germans managed to nick some of it. or rather it went missing whilst it was in their custody between Paris and Granville. I'll let you draw your own conclusions, but I'm fairly convinced that they had it, they had that money away. And there's something that comes up in the June 43 episode, which will probably make you think that's a very likely turn of events, but we'll save that one for June.
Essentially, the sterling was beginning, for various reasons, to disappear from the money supply.
Yeah, and the government were a bit worried about having too much of the government's money in Reichsmarks as well, because they were going to face the same problem.
Okay, now, a lot of RAF activity this month, or is it RAF or is it Allied, would it be true to say?
No, it's mostly RAF. It's our friends from 3 Squadron who are flying Whirlwinds, based at Warnwell, and boy are they active, particularly in May. They're flying a lot of missions now. 263 actually were flying the Whirly bomber, so that's the Whirlwind fighter which has been converted to a bomber role, and they actually lost a few aircraft here and there. Surprisingly, they were doing raids earlier months. They were doing raids on France and the odd one around the Channel Islands, but in April and May it really intensified. They were doing a lot more around the Channel Islands. The Whirlwind wasn't a particularly successful aircraft, but it did turn out to be pretty good when it's being used as a Whirly bomber. And so the 263 Squadron basically ended up taking the aircraft from 137 Squadron, and which was being re-equipped with a different type of aircraft. I think they went to Typhoon. Can't remember off the top of my head. Anyway, but 263 basically saw the Whirlwind out of service pretty much. They'd been pretty much the first squadron to use it and were the last to use it. But they were very effective, and some of their flying was just, you'd be pretty nervous, I think, if you were getting involved in the flying. They're variously described as coming in at mast height, but they're pretty much flying a mission every other day, every couple of days during May, around the Channel Islands. And they talk about they've got Spitfire squadrons based in the same area of England, and so they've got 504 Squadron with their Spitfires. There's also another squadron, just off the top of my head, I've forgotten which one it was. 312 and 313 squadrons as well. They were also doing attacks, but it was really the Whirlwinds. There's an account of one which came across the airport here in Guernsey, so low level that the Germans didn't have time to even know what was happening, and he'd gone before they could even get their guns trained on him. There's accounts of on the 17th of May that there was a raid on the harbour, and apparently they went to Jersey as well. They were coming in at 0 feet, basically. They were attacked by FW-190s, German FW-190s.
Where would they have sprung from then?
Good question. Possibly Jersey. Could well have been here, but I think by 43 the airport was pretty much not being used. That
It was just down to air transport, really, wasn't it? Yeah.
So who knows? Unless they'd been kicking around the area. But these guys were flying in at a very, very low level. There's an account also of one aircraft flying along from the White Rock to the Salary Corner. I've seen this. It's repeated by a couple of people, so it may well be true.
Yeah, I've seen that said.
It said that he's flying just above the height of the seawall with 10 feet of his wing over the road, all the way along there. I mean, probably a good way of avoiding flak, because they're not going to be able to depress it.
But you'd just as likely to have hit a bus if you did that. Just so people know, this is at that speed, Nick. He would have covered the ground pretty quick.
Yeah, and so that was the 17th and the 23rd. There was another big raid in the morning. People got very excited about it. Louis Guillemette was too late getting out from his house to go and see what all the excitement was. By the time he got out of his house, the ship had already sunk. There was all sorts going on, but when you look at the ships that were sunk by these guys, they're incredibly brave with their flying. There were accounts of them taking off in 50-mile-an-hour crosswinds. I mean, you just wouldn't do that these days, but obviously This is a time of war,
Yep.
and they had a few disastrous takeoffs and landings in those raids as well. You're getting heavily damaged aircraft coming back, and they're landing, and they're going, well, that one's right off. They give them a category, and it's like, yeah, that one's right off, or we can do something with that one. But there were a couple of notable ships that were sunk. There was a cargo ship requisitioned by the Germans, and that was carrying 250-pound bombs. That got wrecked off of Jersey, got stuck on the rocks there, much to the amusement of our friend Mr. Lesota, who took great pleasure in going to have a look. And then there was the Oostvlander from St. Malo carrying cement and guns. It was attacked by the RAF and holed 1.5 miles from Speedwell Harbour on the 23rd, with the loss of all hands. But as you'll have noticed, I've got a photograph of the boat. It's not a particularly big boat, but it was sunk carrying lots of concrete, things for fortifications. One of the other things that gets discussed when Louis Guillemette is next at the Feldkommandantur, he points out to the Germans, hang on a minute, right, you're saying that this is towards the end of the month. You're saying that we're not getting food supply because it's being bombed, and it's too difficult to get them here, and it's too risky. How come all your ships are getting here then? Or the ships that are getting sunk are your ships, and they're carrying, and then it's sort of brushed off as no, it's nothing, because he raises in particular, he goes to see them on a Tuesday, and he raises in particular that since the previous Thursday there'd been about 5 ships that had come in, but not one of them had food on.
No, highly suspicious. Okay, just as we finish up here, Nick, morale across the islands. I mean, we know that, the war had, literally another 2 years to run, and things got pretty dark in 1944. There was a sort of feeling that the war, as I said earlier, the tide had turned, and people were relatively upbeat, would you say?
Yeah, they were. The RAF raids were making them upbeat. The news of Tunisia was making them feel upbeat. There was a broadcast, I believe it was on American radio, broadcasting from England, which basically said that there was going to be a second front opened in 1943. So that was immediately thought to be France. Unfortunately for them, it wasn't. But somehow that had been picked up by people on their radios, and there was talk about Churchill was also saying about a second front, so that sort of reinforced it. Well, we've heard this from the Americans, and now we're hearing it from Churchill.
I think they're talking about the invasion of Italy, really, aren't they?
They were, but they've obviously, if you're, Reverend Ord sat here or Louis Guillemette, you're not going to know that that's where the second front is coming. There was also word had got round about a cartoon. I don't know if it was a German that had shown it to somebody local, but it was a cartoon where it showed Hitler and Goering going, where will we land? Looking across at England, and the next one underneath says, where will they land?
So they juxtaposed the
two things, the two questions. So who knows? But the Germans were really, really jittery anyway. They revamped the AARP. We talked about them, the air raid prevention guys, who'd been doing that role. Then they've been stopped from doing that role and were doing other things. They brought them back as a civil defence thing, which basically they were coming back. In Jersey, they were slightly different as well. They brought them back as a civil defence thing, which was in case of an emergency, for emergency sea invasion of the Channel Islands. Then they were to do certain things like deal with fires and things like that. But the Germans actually had an exercise in Jersey for 3 days where they were practicing in case there had been an invasion. I think that got people's hopes up a little bit as well, but on the flip side, the Germans were pretty depressed, and a lot of them were coming back from leave saying, wish they'd sue for peace, that sort of stuff, which was a dangerous thing for them to be saying. But so it was a bit here, there, and everywhere. Going back to the rationing, actually, I know we're a little bit over time, but I think we'll probably be okay in the edit. The Germans also blamed the farmers in Jersey for a lot of trouble. They blamed the farmers in Jersey for the Russians going around nicking stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
They said they'd encouraged them, and that was part of the problem with the rationing. That was towards the end of the month. I think they were just trying to reinforce this is why we've got to keep this rationing. It's got to be worse than it was, because it's your fault, because you've been encouraging the Russians, you've been giving them stuff when they've been begging, things like that, or allowing them to steal. I think that's pretty much us there. I think it was a lot to get through in May 43.
Yeah, and we thank people for their emails, of course. I think you've heard from a gentleman in the last few days, Nick.
Yeah, Mark. Mark, who's almost caught up, I think, with the podcast, despite the fact he only started listening about just over a month ago.
That's pleasing.
As we sit here recording this, he sent me a lovely email.
It was lovely.
He heard me speak at the We Have Waves Festival in September, and then tuned into the podcast. And he's actually been to Jersey on holidays, and he's talking about coming here. So, Mark, thank you very much for your lovely email, and I'm glad you're enjoying the podcast. Hopefully, we'll see you over.
Well, that would be great. And of course, if you wish to email Nick and myself, you can get hold of us at occupied@gnetradio.com, and many of you have done that already, and we always thank you. It's great to hear people's views on the occupation of the Channel Islands. Some of you know quite a lot about it, some of you know a little bit about it, and some people, I meet them and they know next to nothing at all. So we feel that we're getting the word out about how our islands suffered during those dark days.
I knew there was something I forgot to tell you as well. I wrote an article a few years ago about a German that was based here. Gosh, I must have written it about 3, maybe 4 years ago. It's still on my website. And a German lady who is the great-granddaughter of this gentleman actually sent me an email yesterday in German. We had corresponded before a couple of years ago. But she's actually been listening to the podcast. She went back to look at something on my website and saw that we had a podcast, and so she's been listening in to the podcast and is very much enjoying it.
Okay, well, that's great. Nick and I are both tour guides, so we sort of pretty much suspend our tours during the winter season, but I've been doing embarked upon a series of illustrated talks. I did the first one in October about my grandmother's experiences in the occupation. A couple of societies and schools have asked me to talk about those subjects, or that subject again. But if you're in Guernsey and you're listening to this podcast, on the 11th of November at St Martin's Parish Hall, I shall be talking about my grandfather's Royal Naval career, which stretched from 1915 through to back end of 1945. Lots of slides, and he experienced quite a lot. He was in some interesting places and saw some interesting things. And of course, Nick, you mentioned your website, Island Fortress.
Yeah, islandfortress.com. There's lots of things on there that you can go and look at. If you're visiting, it's got some suggestions of places that you might want to go, and a few photographs and things like that. But lots of articles about the occupation, bits and bobs that I've found. Something else I knew I'd forgotten that we needed to mention as well is we're going weekly at the moment, aren't we?
Well, we've certainly committed to it, and I think we'll do it. Well, we will do it.
We will do it.
We will do it.
Yeah. Because we need to get to Christmas 1940 for Christmas 2025. And so we need to go weekly. So we will be putting the show out weekly from now on. This one will be going out on the 10th of November. We'll have had one on the 3rd of November from the Imperial War Museum, and we'll be weekly all the way up to Christmas, probably actually till New Year's Eve.
Yep, we're committed to that. Okay. Right, so I think that's it.
Yeah, I'll shut up now.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and of course we'll be back with you with Nick's trip to the Imperial War Museum. I'm going to see an archive in Cambridge next week. We'll talk about that when I get back, and also, of course, we'll be looking at June 1940.
There's a lot going on in June 1943. I've already been digging around in the archives, and the rationing thing carries on. It takes a bit of a turn, but I'm not going to say any more than that at the moment. Okay, well, I think we'll say our goodbyes. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll be back with you soon. So it's goodbye from me, Keith, and also from Cheery from Nick. Yeah, bye-bye.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7. All his friends and family had gone. Left on a ship 'cause they knew